So what are the first steps with Threagile? So it's that either you create a minimal stub model and evolve on that, so you can use the stub model provided to have a starting point, or you can use the example model just to have something to play with and see how it works. At the end, your YAML file should contain your data assets, your technical assets, the communication links, and the trust boundaries. And then you execute Threagile on that. And here's a simple example. That's just coming from the model example provided in Threagile. That's a data asset modeled here in YAML. So it has an identifier, customer contracts here, an ID to be referenced inside the model, has a description, that's for the documentation generation. And most importantly, at the end, it has those three protection goals of confidentiality, integrity, and availability being rated on a 5-slot scale. So whether it's confidential, strictly confidential, for example, or just restricted or stuff like that. Also for the integrity and availability of that data asset. And you're doing it for every data asset as well. Here from the example model, how to model a technical asset, a component. Here it's just on Apache web server, and you're providing a little bit of question answer things here, like whether it's used as a client, whether it's used as a thing that's sitting on the internet or not. And the technology, that's a very important thing here. You can choose from a broad set of technologies, web server, message queue, database, NoSQL database, stuff like that. So it's a lengthy list of technical elements, and that's exactly important. So to have as less false positive in the threat model analysis as possible. So those risk rules that are basically watching out for those certain technologies and certain combinations of data flow things, and then they create potential risks out of that. So it might make sense to have a detailed, if you name it detailed on that level, kind of modeling where you specifically choose a technology and specifically choose protocols for communication links so that the risk rules that are assessing the model can very precisely spot the issues. For example, you model how and if and how it's encrypted, and also here the confidentiality, integrity, availability things, whether it's used on a multi-tenant or as a multi-tenant component and something like that. Then you're referencing, very important, the data assets that are processed and or stored on that component. So if it were a database-like thing, so it would be more on the stored side, obviously. So that's actually referencing from the set of the data assets modeled in that very same YAML file by their identifiers. And then you're modeling the communication links. That's just like having a directed graph where you're modeling a connection, so that here, for example, that Apache web server thing is now having in its communication links section an outgoing communication link, can be multiple, of course, targeting an ERP system, also by its ID from the same model, and you're specifically choosing a protocol. So Threagile risk rules see, okay, it's HTTPS, that means it's encrypted inherently. If it's an authenticated interface, the connection, then you're modeling what kind of authentication and authorization style. Is it by a certificate, by just session ID, by credentials, by token, or whatever? And a few more questions being answered. And of course, you're referencing the data assets that are sent and received via that connection. So it means you're modeling on the technical view of how the connection is established, so that for the Threagile rules, it's clear to see what, here the target component, what component is offering an interface and having an attack surface that way. And to also see the logical data flow, it's important to differentiate between the send and receive data assets so that you actually see where the data from which to what component is flowing. And you also see who is opening the connection and to what other component that then has a new attack surface of offering that kind of connection interface. Yeah, and finally, you're modeling the trust boundaries in that YAML file. So that's the classic DMZ thing for the classic on-prem networking things, or the cloud security groups, or some Kubernetes isolation, network isolation policy, stuff like that, whatever fits your architecture best. So that's just by isolating the components against the rest of the model that way in a trust style. And you're referencing for those trust boundaries the technical assets that are inside, and you can even nest them, stacking those things like trust boundaries into each other. Okay, and then you execute Threagile. That's just processing the YAML model file, which then is being read by Threagile, and the risk rules are executing, including the custom edit ones, if you developed some, and it creates some nice output.